whole country was gripped in this great battle between the peers and the people.
The reaction in the upper house was absolute fury.
The King pleaded with the peers not to reject a financial measure, but they took no notice.
Absolutely everything in British politics is at stake.
So let's take a look at what happened in British politics in 1910, and along the way we'll be hearing from modern historians and academics about their interpretation of these events. Welcome to our special programme reporting on the general election of January 1910. It's been an extraordinary campaign. Information has been sent around the kingdom by telephone and telegram. On January the 15th, large crowds gathered by the newspaper offices in London's Fleet Street to watch as the first major results were projected onto lantern screens. There have been other gatherings across the country in the days and weeks since. We've had further polls and dozens more results. To set the scene, let's show you a chart from The Times, which indicates the number of seats gained or lost by the Liberals and the Unionists. Just in case that's not immediately clear, we've asked our graphic artist to outline the state of the parties at the dissolution of Parliament. In 1906, the Liberals won a resounding victory. They took 399 of the 670 seats. By the dissolution of this Parliament, they had 373 seats. Their main opponents, the Conservatives and Unionists, could muster 168 seats. But of course, the Liberals also benefited from the support of the Irish nationalist MPs and from the newcomers on the political scene, the Labour Party. That gave the Liberals a significant majority in the House. Well, we're joined now from Westminster by our correspondent Simon Vaughan. So, Mr Vaughan, are the Liberals hoping to repeat their success of 1906?
Yes, that's right. You will, of course, recall that the Liberals won a notable victory that year. But they have had their troubles since.
They've won a great landslide in 1906, partly because the Conservative Party has split into three, collapsed entirely, has actually left office before the election, so divided are they, and on a great wave of radical hope. But then they can't do anything, partly because the Conservative Party hold the House of Lords and do not have the theory we have today that if it's in the manifesto it will pass. They have a different theory that they shall decide whether or not something is in the national interest, and if they think it isn't, they will throw it out.
After 1906, you face a landslide Liberal majority in the House of Commons and a landslide Conservative majority in the House of Lords. Now, there'd never been the starkness of this divide in the past. The third development is the growth of what we would now call fiscal politics, of a Liberal Party that was starting to develop the welfare state, needed to raise significant additional sums for it, but also, because we're in the run-up to the First World War, significant rearmament that was needed. And Lloyd George decided to get a good part of it from the very wealthy, including a super tax and a whole set of land taxes, which the aristocracy saw as a straight attack on them.
There has been a particularly dangerous disagreement over the budget of 1909. Mr Lloyd George's measures did not meet the approval of the upper house.
Oh, indeed they did not. Their lordships rejected them, didn't they?
Indeed, indeed. There has been what some might term a battle of wills between the upper and lower houses. Some are even describing the conflict as the peers versus the people.
The reaction in the upper house was absolute fury. Peers took to the country denouncing the budget as the end of Christianity, the end of civilization, the end of property, the end of family, the end of everything.
So a case of peers versus the people, a serious dispute.
Well, as you may know, many members of the upper house are Conservative. Some might say the Conservatives have an inbuilt majority there. The leader of the opposition in the Commons, Mr Balfour, has been accused of using that power base in the Lords to thwart the political programme of the elected government. The Education Bill, Small Landowners Scotland Bill, to name two, were destroyed, and Mr Lloyd George has claimed the upper house has become Mr Balfour's poodle.
So he not only introduced the budget, which had quite a lot of proposals of super tax, land duties and so on, which the aristocracy didn't like, but he went out of his way to attack them viciously in public with a series of great speeches, which only further exacerbated their antipathy. You know, he described the House of Lords as 500 men chosen at random from amongst the ranks of the unemployed. It was great phrases like this, which helped ensure that the House of Lords did in fact reject the budget, which is precisely what he had wanted them to do, so that then the election which followed would be a peers versus people election, and Lloyd George and the new group of leaders in the Liberal Party, which included not just Asquith but also Winston Churchill, who was great at peer baiting and attacking the Lords, they all believed that that was an issue on which they could win.
This is the closest British democratic politics comes to class war. We're much closer to class war in a Conservative-Liberal battle of 1910 than the Conservatives and the Labour Party ever were later on. And that's one of the reasons it's frightening, because Lloyd George is seen as mounting a demotic appeal, talking about the aristocracy, talking about the peerage, having great rallies of people and using demotic language. And it is about class. And of course it's about class on both sides. And it's very, very clear that what is being mounted is a defence of class interests.
But to reject a budget, surely that's unprecedented.
Well, I can't think of another example. This is nothing short of open warfare between the upper house and the lower house. It undermines the very foundation of the kingdom's system of government. There is whispered, but there is very real talk of reform.
If you wanted to reform the power of the House of Lords, if you wanted to take away its absolute veto, its ability to stop any legislation becoming law unless it agreed to it, there's a bit of a conundrum here. Because if you want to take away that power, the House of Lords itself has got to agree to it. So how can you force the House of Lords to agree to abolish its own power? Well, the only way that seemed possible was if the King would threaten to create literally hundreds and hundreds of Liberal peers.
Now, in 1910, the two kings, George V and Edward VII, they acted on the advice of ministers. They were constitutional monarchs, but they did play a little part in politics. For example, Edward VII said he wouldn't be prepared to create enough peers to swamp the House of Lords to get a Parliament Act through limiting the powers of the House of Lords. He said he wouldn't be prepared to do that without two general elections, and that probably is a political intervention.
The monarchy and the aristocracy were very, very closely aligned. The king was the leader of society. It was still in a society where the aristocracy is immensely powerful, socially as well as economically. And, of course, the great aristocratic families all have very close relations with the king. I mean, the king would customarily spend his weekends going and shooting on their various estates. Much, much closer than now. And when the crisis is literally forced upon him, because the Lords do reject the budget, and Asquith is determined to seek to restrict the powers of the House of Lords, he does his damnedest to try and avoid having to create 400 or 500 peers, or give any commitment to creating them, not just because he didn't want to take such a controversial step, but because he did not want to dilute the aristocracy.
Turning now to our parliamentary correspondent Daniel Britton, who's with me in the studio. So how has the campaign gone?
Miss Quinn, it's been a most exciting campaign, I have to say that. And real political tension in the air, because as you remember, the Liberals won a majority of 100 in 1906, but they've lost a lot of seats in by-elections, particularly in 1908. But then, in 1909, we saw that budget, which was revolutionary in our terms, really.
The People's Budget.
The People's Budget, as indeed Mr Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, campaigned on in Limehouse last year. And again, later last year, in Newcastle, he made the most impressive speech defending his budget, where he compared the cost of running a Duke in the House of Lords with the cost of a dreadnought ship. He said a fully equipped Duke costs as much to keep up as 2 dreadnoughts, and Dukes are just as great a terror, and they last longer. That was a very, very compelling speech, and the issues that have followed from that have been the backbone of this election campaign.
How have the people reacted? Obviously, that's the question. Has the voting gone well?
Well, the voting has been happening, Miss Quinn, certainly. But whether it has gone well depends on whether you support the Unionists or the Liberals. From the Liberal government's point of view, maybe I think they could be slightly unhappy. We've been watching the results come in slowly from January the 15th right up until the present day. Voting, of course, taking place in stages around the country, voting and then the results. And the results would not appear to have gone the way the Liberals might have hoped for. I would doubt very much if they're going to see a large majority in this Parliament.
Thank you very much. More from you later. Now, we also have a correspondent who has been following the fortunes of the main opposition, the Conservatives and Unionists. Let's join them now. So, is Mr Balfour confident of doing well?
Yes, I think he is. The Conservatives and their allies in the Liberal Unionist Party are both expecting to make significant gains. And I'm told that the mood inside the Carlton Club is confident. Now, don't forget, they lost rather badly at the last election, and they're betting on improving their performance this time round. Now, Mr Balfour, the leader of the Conservative Party, said in his election address that the government were trying to neuter the House of Lords and to create a House of Commons that was independent not just of the peers, but also of the people. Now, these views are clearly resonating with electors because they are undoubtedly gaining ground.
The electorate in 1910 was restricted by modern standards. It was about half of adult males, I think somewhat more than half of adult males had the vote, and of course no women had the vote. But it was a very politicised society. Huge numbers of people used to turn up to public meetings and election meetings in 1910. Big marches, demonstrations and so on, including many people who didn't have the vote.
Well, to stay in power, it's looking as if the Liberals might have to rely on the support of the Irish Nationalists, a group with a clear agenda. Our correspondent reports for us now.
For decades now, Irish nationalists have been campaigning for self-government under the banner of Home Rule. Mr Gladstone supported it, of course, but Unionists and Conservatives have been equally determined to prevent it happening. At present, the measure stands little chance of passing in the House of Lords. But if this election result is close, the Liberals may find themselves depending on Mr Redmond and his nationalists, and that could work to their advantage. Aidan James, reporting from Westminster.
There is, of course, a new political grouping contesting this election, the Labour Party. Our correspondent, Mr Wilson, can tell us more.
Yes, well, as you know, the Labour Representation Committee was set up at the turn of the century by the former mine worker Keir Hardie. That group renamed as the Labour Party. And in 1906, they won their first seats in Parliament. They won 29 seats that time, but they're hoping to increase their share in this election.
And where is their support coming from?
Well, they claim to represent the workers of the kingdom. And Mr Hardie certainly stands out in this Parliament.
And you mentioned Mr Hardie. Is he playing a prominent role?
Well, Mr Hardie is a fantastic orator, and he's addressed great crowds in his time. And he continues to play a prominent role in Parliament, but he's also turning his attentions to a new cause, securing the vote for women.
Yes, something of a sideshow in this campaign, you might say, but a vocal one. It's the campaign by certain individuals for female suffrage. They're using the slogan, Votes for Women. A word from our special correspondent.
Railings like these are a symbol of the campaign for female suffrage. Women have chained themselves to railings outside Parliament and other public buildings to draw attention to their demands. We've become familiar with the suffragists, but their efforts have failed to secure women the vote. So now there's a new kind of campaigner. Dubbed the suffragettes, they've opted for civil disobedience.
This group is led by Mrs Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel, the founders of the Women's Social and Political Union. Their motto is deeds, not words. They argue that only militant action will secure their objectives now. They have even tried to storm Parliament, with one woman making it onto the floor of the Commons chamber. Mrs Pankhurst was jailed for her part in this action.
So there have been marches, there have been rallies, and there has been violence. Mr Asquith has refused their demands, but a new administration will be under increasing pressure to address them. Rosalind Ball, reporting from Westminster.
Well, who knows how that drama might play out. Here with me again in our studio is our parliamentary correspondent Daniel Britton. What about the gentlemen seeking election this time? How have they been doing?
Many gentlemen have been seeking election and many have been elected, Miss Quinn. Looking at the ranks of the House of Commons, you might be mistaken for thinking it looks like the House of Lords, because many eldest sons of peers are represented in the new House of Commons. I've got a list here. Viscount Morpeth has won in Birmingham South. The Earl of Ronaldsay in Hornsey. Viscount Castlereagh has returned again in Maidstone. And Lord Henry Cavendish Bentinck is once again MP for Nottingham South. That seat in Nottingham, an area known as the Dukeries, because so many dukes have their seats in that immediate area. And of course the Cavendish Bentinks are the sons of the Duke of Portland. There are others I might mention: Earl Winterton, Viscount Duncannon, Viscount Dalrymple, Viscount Lewisham and Sir Alexander Fuller Ackland Hood, Baronet.
Some notable names among them, and some no doubt destined for the upper house.
Some may be destined for the upper house, maybe, especially if the King were to grant many new peers, which there has been much speculation about. Sir John Benn, the Liberal MP, himself the son of a Liberal MP, he lost the Plymouth seat in Devonport seat in Plymouth, but his son, William Wedgwood Benn, has been elected to his father's old constituency in East London, St George's in the east. So, father and son, still related in politics.
A political dynasty in the making, perhaps?
Who knows what will happen there?
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to interrupt you now, because I think that we can go to our first analysis of the final results. Remember, these results have been transmitted to us by the latest telegraph technology. Communications have been sent across the kingdom over these several weeks. We understand Mr Asquith has also been kept informed by telegraph. So we do have the final figures, and it's a mixed picture for the Liberals. They've lost many seats, down to 274, but they had been expecting to lose many more. A good result for the Unionists, who are now just behind them on 272. It looks like the Irish Nationalists now have 82 seats and the Labour Party has 40. Well, let's discuss the implications with our correspondent Daniel Britton. So, Mr Britton, what does this mean for the kingdom, the empire, Mr Asquith and his party?
We're certainly heading, Miss Quinn, to a very balanced Parliament, as you might say, a balance between the parties. The Liberals should be just the largest party, but if they're to form a government, they will have to form a government with the Irish Nationalists and this is a big change, with the small Labour Party. And if they're to form a coalition, then clearly some issues are going to be of particular importance. For the Irish Nationalists, Home Rule for Ireland. And for the Liberals themselves, of course, and no doubt the Labour Party, reform of the upper house.
I soon found the House of Commons almost as excitable as my Chelsea meetings. Party feeling had never been more bitter. The Liberals were out for revenge against the House of Lords, and the Conservatives were savage over Home Rule and the Parliament Bill. For a young member, the House of Commons of 1910 was a frightening place. The Conservative whip's room was run like the orderly room of a Guards regiment. Ackland Hood, the chief whip, known as the Pinkin, was determined that his men should parade in full strength, and that there should be no talking in the ranks. The new members were there to vote, and not to speak.
My job as a whip was very dull. As they say in the jargon of Parliament, we had to make a house, keep a house, and cheer the ministers. In a word, our leaders were never to be in the wrong, and were always to win in the divisions. The main battle of the time was the fight with the House of Lords, the build-up for the passage of the Parliament Act. It involved 2 elections in 1910, and for me a by-election as well.
Welcome to our second general election special of 1910. Back in February, remember, we brought you the inconclusive results of the year's first election. Now, in December, the country is going to the polls again. A highly unusual occurrence, of course, and here's why it's happened. In May, His Majesty King Edward VII died. We have a new king, George V. The People's Budget has been forced through Parliament, but the political crisis has deepened. The government wants to cut the powers of the upper house, but any measure would require the approval of the peers themselves. And as things stand, that seems unlikely. The main parties have held a constitutional conference to try to resolve the issue. There's even been talk of a grand coalition, but no agreement has been reached. In a moment, we'll be hearing from our royal editor, Sean Curran, who's with me. But first, let's talk to our political correspondent, Alistair Rendell, who's at Westminster. So the kingdom once again consumed by an election. Remind us of the key events of the last few months.
Well, as you know, the House of Lords did pass the finance bill eventually, but there were no guarantees about the fate of other government bills. Of course, the Liberals no longer enjoy a large majority in the Commons. They've relied on the support of the Irish Nationalists and the Labour Party. But all three parties, Liberals, Nationalists and Labour, want to curb the powers of the upper house.
So Mr Asquith has now tabled proposals to rein them in.
Yes, he wants to end their right to amend or reject money bills and to reduce the amount of time the Lords can delay legislation. Mr Asquith is keen to restrain the powers of the Lords. The Lords themselves are less keen.
And what about talk of the monarch creating many Liberal peers?
Well, that picture is a complicated one. You recall there was talk back in January of the late King agreeing to create peers, but only if the people had voted for it at 2 general elections. There does seem to have been some development, however, in Mr Asquith's views. There was a speech in April which led commentators to believe that the Cabinet were insisting that the King should promise to create peers, even before a second general election. We've also had a change of monarch over this period, and we must now consider the views, of course, of the new King, George V.
Let's just bring in our royal editor, Sean Curran, who's here with me. So tell us, what do we know of His Majesty's opinions?
Well, we know that he's being consulted and he's being kept up to date with everything that's going on. We're hearing from private sources that there may be certain guarantees that have been given about the creation of new peers, so people appointed to the upper house to help force through the Parliament bill. This is a time of great constitutional crisis, and this is what we're hearing, but I have to stress these are from private conversations and from private sources.
Because we don't know the monarch's true thoughts.
No, officially we have no idea what the King is thinking. We know that he is well briefed and kept well informed, but we don't know what his thoughts are, and they've not been made public. But we do know that there is this threat now of this creation of new peers who could be used to force through the Parliament bill, and it would appear as though the Prime Minister is very keen that the monarch should act on the advice of, well, the Prime Minister.
So might the King have to confront the aristocracy then?
Well, this would be the fear, yes. No matter how well briefed or consulted the King is, there is this concern that there may be some sort of confrontation with the aristocracy, and this is all because of this threat to essentially flood the House of Lords with new members in order to get these very controversial bills through Parliament.
Quite a task for a new king to take on.
It is. Of course, he's very well informed and he's been very well educated, but nevertheless, these are very challenging times for the king and the kingdom.
Sean Curran, thank you very much. Let's go back for a moment to our political correspondent, Alistair Rendell. A quick word from you then about these talks.
Yes, there has been a constitutional conference to try to resolve the political crisis. The meetings began in June and continued until November, but with no positive outcome. The issue of Home Rule remained a particular sticking point.
The reason why the Lords were so hostile to the Parliament bill wasn't simply to keep their own powers, but because if the absolute veto of the Lords was removed, Irish Home Rule could be passed without a further general election. And the Conservative Party felt that a measure of this major importance, which they felt could break up the United Kingdom, that this should not be passed without the people having their say.
After a long talk, I agreed most reluctantly. to give the Cabinet a secret understanding that in the event of the government being returned with a majority at the general election, I should use my prerogative to make peers if asked for. I disliked having to do this very much, but agreed that this was the only alternative to the Cabinet resigning, which at this moment would be disastrous.
Well, I think we now have the results of this second general election. As you recall, voting took place between December the 3rd and December the 19th. Just to remind you, in the January poll, Mr Asquith's lead over the Conservatives and Unionists was much reduced. The Liberals were on 274 seats and the opposition on 272. Now, just look at these figures. If the one independent Conservative is added to the official party's MPs, then the seats are tied, 272 for both the Liberals and the official opposition. Bear in mind that the numbers for the Irish Nationalists and the Labour Party are little changed, and we have almost the same result as before. Well, Sean Curran, the Kingdom is voting once again, it seems, for the Liberals and their allies and against the peers. So what might the King do now? What might that mean for the King?
Now that the people have spoken, I think it is now time for His Majesty to decide whether or not he is going to act. As we've said, there is this threat, this apparent guarantee that there would be new peers created in order to get the bills through the House of Lords.
What would that mean for the upper house?
Well, it's bound to be very controversial. We know already that a great many Conservatives are extremely unhappy. There is talk in Conservative circles of a fight to the very last ditch. There are others in the House of Lords who are more happy to do a compromise, and they are thinking of hedging their position. We're going to have to wait now to see what the pressures on His Majesty will be in the coming days, and also what pressures will come on those peers as well, as they finally have to make their decision whether they're going to fight to the last ditch or whether they're going to hedge.
So there could be a real split in the upper house.
I think this is a genuine constitutional crisis, and peers now are going to have to split, and we may see the ending of some long-standing friendships and alliances as this row comes to its end.
Sean Curran, thank you. Well, that's all from me and this special election programme. Goodbye, and thanks very much for joining us.
When it becomes clear that one way or another the King will agree to creating the peers, at that point the Conservatives split.
Those Conservatives who voted for the Parliament Bill or abstained were seen as traitors by those who fought in the last ditch, but they did save the King from a humiliation.
Although the crisis appears to be resolved, the Liberals seem to win it, they get the Parliament Act and so on, you actually have a polity on the brink of civil war, because it's still going to break down over Ireland, and the opposition are not going to accept defeat on that question.
The whole country was gripped in this great battle between the peers and the people.
The reaction in the upper house was absolute fury.
The King pleaded with the peers not to reject a financial measure, but they took no notice.
Absolutely everything in British politics is at stake.
So let's take a look at what happened in British politics in 1910, and along the way we'll be hearing from modern historians and academics about their interpretation of these events. Welcome to our special programme reporting on the general election of January 1910. It's been an extraordinary campaign. Information has been sent around the kingdom by telephone and telegram. On January the 15th, large crowds gathered by the newspaper offices in London's Fleet Street to watch as the first major results were projected onto lantern screens. There have been other gatherings across the country in the days...
Yes, that's right. You will, of course, recall that the Liberals won a notable victory that year. But they have had their troubles since.
They've won a great landslide in 1906, partly because the Conservative Party has split into three, collapsed entirely, has actually left office before the election, so divided are they, and on a great wave of radical hope. But then they can't do anything, partly because the Conservative Party hold the House of Lords and do not have the theory we have today that if it's in the manifesto it will pass. They have a different theory that they shall decide whether or not something is in the national interest, and if they think it isn't, they will throw it out.
After 1906, you face a landslide Liberal majority in the House of Commons and a landslide Conservative majority in the House of Lords. Now, there'd never been the starkness of this divide in the past. The third development is the growth of what we would now call fiscal politics, of a Liberal Party that was starting to develop the welfare state, needed to raise significant additional sums for it, but also, because we're in the run-up to the First World War, significant rearmament was needed. And Lloyd George decided to get a good part of it from the very wealthy, including a super tax and a whole set of land taxes, which the aristocracy saw as a straight attack on them.
There has been a particularly dangerous disagreement over the budget of 1909. Mr. Lloyd George's measures did not meet the approval of the upper house.
Oh, indeed they did not. Their lordships rejected them, didn't they?
Indeed, indeed. There has been what some might term a battle of wills between the upper and lower houses. Some are even describing the conflict as the peers versus the people.
The reaction in the upper house was absolute fury. Peers took to the country denouncing the budget as the end of Christianity, the end of civilization, the end of property, the end of family, the end of everything.
So a case of peers versus the people, a serious dispute.
Well, as you may know, many members of the upper house are Conservative. Some might say the Conservative...
And weeks since, we've had further polls and dozens more results. To set the scene, let's show you a chart from The Times, which indicates the number of seats gained or lost by the Liberals and the Unionists. Just in case that's not immediately clear, we've asked our graphic artist to outline the state of the parties at the dissolution of Parliament. In 1906, the Liberals won a resounding victory. They took 399 of the 670 seats. By the dissolution of this Parliament, they had 373 seats. Their main opponents, the Conservatives and Unionists, could muster 168 seats. But of course, the Liberals also benefited from the support of the Irish nationalist MPs and from the newcomers on the political scene, the Labour Party. That gave the Liberals a significant majority in the House. Well, we're joined now from Westminster by our correspondent Simon Vaughan. So, Mr Vaughan, are the Liberals hoping to repeat their success of 1906?